In 1876, a group of criminals in central Illinois had a counterfeiting ring, and things were going pretty well for them until their master engraver was imprisoned, and soon their supply of counterfeit bills was almost gone, and so the gang needed a plan to bust their engraver out of prison, and somehow along the way in the planning stages, they came up with the idea that they would steal the body of President Abraham Lincoln, which was buried in Springfield, and they would ransom it to the U.S. government for $200,000. It's a long leap from trying to get somebody out of prison to stealing the body of a president. Unfortunately for the would-be grave robbers, they had big mouths, and they shared their plan with a lot of people. And eventually someone they told alerted authorities, and even though the men tried to follow through, in fact, they had pulled Lincoln's casket about 15 feet up, they were surrounded by the police. The police didn't catch them that night somehow, but they caught them about 10 days later in Chicago. In 1901, Robert Lincoln, son of the president, decided to reconstruct his father's tomb, which was now the family tomb, and implement some security features. Now, there weren't cameras that someone could watch 24 hours a day back then, and so what would you do if you needed to implement some security features? Well, Robert Lincoln decided that he was going to have his father buried in a cage, put 10 feet down, and then covered in cement. The safekeeping of a beloved president, the permanency, at least at that time, now we would say, oh, we have all these tools, we could get it all. But at that time, the permanency of concrete to keep his descendants and the country's minds at ease, that Lincoln's body is where it should be. A very different situation than we find ourselves in on this Easter morning when we have the empty tomb to show that Christ is not there, and we celebrate it. Early on this morning, we find ourselves in Luke's Gospel. Early on this morning, we journey in the shadows with those who go to the tomb. We're told that they go to the tomb with spices that they had prepared, spices they had prepared for the body of a loved one. They're expecting to find Jesus in the tomb. Did they walk slowly? Taking in the last week of the triumphal parade into Jerusalem, the Last Supper, and the crucifixion? Did they talk on the journey? Was it silent? Was there prayer along the way? We don't know. But we know that they go to the tomb and they find that stone rolled away. And I liked Cruz's surprised face, because that's what we imagine they look like. But they go in anyway, and they find that Jesus isn't there in any form, and we're told that they're perplexed, they're baffled, they're puzzled, they're confused. However you want to put it, they're not really sure what is going on, and we wouldn't be really sure about what was going on. Then, we're told two men in dazzling clothes appear, two men who we assume Luke means to be angels, and the women are terrified. Now we have the beginnings of the identification of these people who make their way to the tomb early on this morning. And later we will learn their names in the text. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and there are some other women who are not named. The women are terrified, They put their faces to the ground. Who wouldn't be terrified? The body of Jesus is not there, and now two men in dazzling clothes have appeared before them. I'd be a little terrified. Are these women in trouble for being at the tomb? For being in the tomb of the one who was killed for political insurrection by the Romans? Keep in mind that the Romans were watching the tomb. Do these women know that they're experiencing something divine? And if they do they really understand it? We have to remember that the women did not go to the tomb this morning expecting it to be empty. We go to the tomb expecting it to be empty. They went to the tomb expecting Jesus to be in it to anoint his body for his days sealed in the tomb. The two men say to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." They go and tell the women to go back. Think about the ministry of Jesus. Go back before this last week. What did you hear? What do you know? What did Jesus talk about? Remember that he told you that the Son of Man must be handed over and crucified, and on the third day will rise again. We can almost hear the echoes inside the tomb of the women sighing and saying, "That's right. We remember. He said that." Memory is a powerful thing. We sit in a position over 2,000 years later when we know what has happened. We can tell the story. We can share the good news without even having to open our Bibles. We can paraphrase or directly quote these scriptures on Easter morning. But early in the morning, in the shadows of the tomb, these women need a memory prompt because this last week has been hectic. Their lives have gone from triumphal entry to traumatic death. When the disciples left, and I hate when people say, did all of Jesus' friends abandon him? Because not all of Jesus' friends abandoned him. The disciples abandoned him as we know them to be the 12 or the 11. But as he was dying, the women were there. He was not abandoned. And so these women have gone from triumph to grief. Trauma to grief in 1 week. We all know it can happen. It's happened to all of us. We identify with the situation. So if we put ourselves in the mindset of these women, we can understand the shock. We're told that these women returned from the tomb. Exactly where they returned to is unknown. I think what it means to say is that the women run from the tomb to go tell the 11 and all the rest who were in hiding because they fear for their lives what has happened to Jesus. They go to say the tomb is empty. You can be certain that the women probably didn't leave the tomb as slowly as they approached it. They tell the others what had happened because the message of the empty tomb is for everyone, for the community, not just a select few. This morning before church, Cooper and Kerrigan and I were talking about communion at the baptism service and how communion is for the community because the good news is for the community. It's interesting, though. We're not told what the women say. It's unfortunate that these women who witnessed the crucifixion and now are the first to encounter the empty tomb are given no dialogue at all. No recorded dialogue for the first sermon after the resurrection. We credit the first sermon after the resurrection to Peter later on. But think about it. In real life, they would have had to have spoken. They would have probably said something to the two men in the tomb. And we know that in order to share the good news with the disciples in hiding, that the women had to speak. Yet we're told that the men think that they're telling idle tales. After the women speak, Peter gets up and takes his run to the tomb. Does Peter believe the women when the others don't? Does Peter remember what Jesus said? He gets up and he runs. He needs to see it for himself. And when he sees the linen cloths by themselves in the empty tomb, we're told he returns to the hiding place, amazed. An unknown author has written, "Christmas is the promise, Easter is the proof." Christmas is the promise, Easter is the proof. We cannot talk about Easter without talking about Christmas. And this morning, Susan and I were talking about how Easter is like Christmas. When you show up at church early and you have to make sure everything's in order. At Christmas, we celebrate the birth of the Christ child and the hope for the world, a Savior born unto us, the one who will teach us how to live, the one who will teach us how to pray, the one who will teach us to love one another, the one who only wants the best for us. And at Easter, on this morning, we celebrate the empty tomb. Jesus the Christ has been crucified, but on the third day, the tomb is empty. Resurrection, the raising of Christ from the dead, the promise, the proof that Jesus is who he says he is, the Son of the living God. The resurrection of Christ is a promise that this life is not the only place for us. The proof that death does not have the final word, that the majesty of God is something to behold, even if we don't fully understand it. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands who think they fully understand it, because we're not going to kid ourselves on this Easter morning. The empty tomb issues an invitation to us to be the hands and feet of Christ, to live as Jesus lived. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is a call to community, to share a meal with friends and family like we will later on, but also to share meals with our enemies. The resurrection is a call to discipleship, a call to love God and to love our neighbors, to help those who are broken, hurting, and helpless. A call to share the good news that not even death can contain Jesus, that the love of God knows no boundaries. The empty tomb is a call to question powers that claim they should be worshipped above our God. A call to issuing prophetic challenges to those who often oppress and suppress our neighbors. The empty tomb reminds us that we are loved beyond measure. We are loved more than we will ever be able to know. Maybe we'll know in the next life. But in this life, more than we can know. And it reminds us that Jesus commanded his disciples and commands us to love one another. In the last week, our Savior has been arrested, tortured, crucified, but today the tomb is empty. We rejoice for an empty tomb. We rejoice in the knowledge that death and death-dealing ways of the world do not have the final say. That even though our brothers and sisters in Sri Lanka this morning are mourning, they also take their hope that death does not have the final say. And in a show of gratitude, we are called to breathe life into the world, to bring about resurrection in other people and situations. This ends this morning's word. Thanks be to God.